So Todd, this is not a done deal. It's still in the early consideration stages, but your reporting shows we're talking about the IRS, which is part of the Treasury Department. How far along the process do we think they are?
It's unclear. We just know that the Treasury is considering these proposals. The Office of Tax Policy, where these sorts of rules are normally drafted and considered, is discussing the possibility of codifying what Trump has threatened Harvard with and Columbia with, revoking their tax-exempt status, the 501c3 status that nonprofits across the U.S., earn the privilege, have the privilege of having, and mean that they don't have to pay collectively billions and billions of dollars in taxes, potentially revoking that status in order to ensure that these schools don't discriminate on race in any context, don't favor racial groups, whether that's with facilities that they use, programs that they're a part of, scholarships that students from certain ethnic minority backgrounds might have access to, and essentially forcing these schools to adopt race-blind policies or risk, their financial stability in many cases.
Raceblind policies across everything they do as well, because I'm curious how you think this fits in with the Supreme Court ruling 2 years ago that universities can't use race as a factor in their admissions. That was very specific to admissions.
Sure, yeah, and we know, yeah, exactly. I mean, that 2023 case against Harvard, we know that, it basically said you can't factor in race at all in admissions. That did change some of the admission stats that we saw out of Harvard afterwards. But those kinds of, policies haven't necessarily filtered through in other areas of campus life. And this seems to be a way that the Treasury Department is considering using tax law and tax guidance to make sure that those same principles are applied across campus life. And as we know, the Trump administration has kicked up a fuss a lot about perceived left-wing bias in higher education higher education institutions across the U.S. And it's also a sign that this goes beyond the Department of Education now. This is looking at levers across the government, in the Treasury Department, maybe in the IRS, financial levers that the Trump administration can use to achieve those same social policy ends.
So you mentioned how the White House has targeted Harvard, it's also targeted Columbia and these elite schools, but this kind of move would affect universities far beyond the most elite schools. You talked a little bit about how the tax-exempt status saves these schools a lot of money, but how else do private universities benefit from their tax-exempt status?
Yeah, I mean, Scarlett, you're talking about 1,500 colleges and universities across the U.S. here. Small, non-profit private colleges, maybe in the Midwest and in the Northeast, schools that don't necessarily have a huge cushion or a huge endowment like Harvard, and now being potentially being forced to change the way that they run a lot of their campus in order to comply with this and maintain their financial stability. And you're right, because this goes beyond a lot of the normal financial ways they do it. The tax deductions that donors get.
Yeah.
These schools get tax-exempt status on the interest that they, that their bonds pay out. For instance, they don't have to pay tax on the educational buildings that they own on campus. And it's not just federal tax that we're talking about. 501c3 status also applies on a local level to local taxes. Often in state level taxes and local taxes will also recognize that status to save those colleges and institutions tax on a local level.
Yep.
So it also depends, the potential implications here are quite wide-ranging. They depend on where these schools might be in the US. It also depends, obviously, on how much they rely on philanthropy versus how much they might rely on their endowments to support them financially. So the potential knock-on effects here are really vast.
Really vast, and just to tie it back to our Muni Moment segment, which is, a lot of these schools will then be forced to dip into the public markets to raise money to continue funding themselves. Does this move, should the Treasury follow through with it, require any kind of approval from Congress?
No, I mean, so one of the key things about this is that it would be amending revenue procedures that already exist. And revenue procedures are essentially a form of guidance that the Treasury gives to the IRS and how the IRS should enforce existing law. So it basically is a layer over existing legislation that doesn't need congressional approval. The Treasury can essentially enforce these on their own.